Welcome to the second lecture of Literary Criticism and Theory. I am Dr. Fouzi Slisli and I will be presenting this lecture for you. Our class today, our lecture is called The Stories Behind the Stories number 2, and here we will talk about the relationship of European literature to ancient Rome or to classical antiquity. In the previous lecture we talked about the relationship of Roman literature to ancient Greece. Today we will talk about the relationship of European literature to classical antiquity, to Rome and Greece. In the Renaissance, Europeans rediscovered the books of the Greeks and the Romans, and that allowed them to develop a literature and a culture. This period is called the Renaissance because across Europe people wanted to revive the ancient learning of Rome and Greece. European literature emerged essentially as a revival of the literature of Rome and Greece. During the Renaissance, Europe was, of course we have to remember that, Europe at the Renaissance, even with the Renaissance, not everybody was educated and lectured and spoke many languages. The majority of the Europeans during the Renaissance, Europe was far less sophisticated than Rome and Greece were. There were no written languages in Europe. The only written language was Latin, and people who could speak or could read Greek, like for example Erasmus, were very rare. So we have an underdeveloped continent in Europe essentially. It is largely illiterate, and all of a sudden this continent discovers the vast legacy of the ancient world. They found the books of the Greeks and the Romans, hundreds and hundreds of texts and books that no one had seen for hundreds of years in Europe. This material, of course, these books will transform the mind of Europe and will lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and of course the modern technological world in which we live today. First, there is the central idea, as far as literature is concerned, the central idea is that the relationship between Europe, the cultures, the literatures of Europe and classical antiquity is a relationship of contradictions and confusions. In other words, like the Romans, the Europeans wanted to produce poems, books and sophisticated culture because they thought, like the Romans did, that high culture, great books and poems were what great and mighty nations have. Great and mighty nations have great languages, they have great books, and they have great poems. So the Europeans in the 16th and 17th century, they were busy building big empires, maritime empires. They were developing colonies in the Americas. They were taking over trade routes to Asia. They were controlling the Mediterranean. So Europe was becoming, big and influential. And within Europe, there were few empires that were already emerging: Spain, France, Holland, England. And these empires, of course, to be an empire, it's not easy. You need to manage. The bigger the empire is, the more there is need for management. And the most important tool for management, one of the most important tools to manage a big empire, is a sophisticated language. And this is the reason, the main reason that gave the impetus, that gave the push, if you want, for the development of European literature and European languages with the speed that we know. So the idea essentially was that great nations do great deeds. They conquer places, they conquer people and places and land, and then they record those great deeds and conquests in great books and poems. They have something to show for it. So, for example, we know that this is the reasoning at the time in the Renaissance. In the books of Renaissance writers, they would say, we know that the Romans were great empire because they have left their traces. We can see their architecture. We can see their books, right? These are proof that they were a great nation. So therefore, they concluded that great nations have military and political power and the ability to record that power in books and poems and literature and so on. To give you an example of this type of thinking that was predominant in the 16th and 17th century, let's look at a French writer who published in 1520, for example. His name is Joachim du Bellay. Joachim du Bellay. He wrote a book that became very famous and provided guidelines for writers and poets to develop their skills and become good writers. Essentially, people like Joachim du Bellay were providing were giving advice to their fellow writers, to the French writers of his time, just like Horace did in Rome. So Joachim du Bellay wrote this book. It's called La défense et l'illustration de la langue française. Essentially it means the defense and the illustration of the French language. Many other European books were written like that, and some of them were called the defense and the illustration of the Italian language, the defense and the illustration of the English language. These are the books that essentially provided guidelines for Europeans how to develop their languages, and all of them, they agreed that literature, poems, plays, and literature in general is the best way to develop their languages. Of course, you have to remember that European languages were not written. This is the time when the European languages started becoming written. This is the time when European languages started developing rules for grammar, for pronunciation, for, of course, for example, there was no standard pronunciation. English, for example, had different various pronunciations between the north, the south, the east, the west, from this tribe to this tribe. So it's only at some point after the Renaissance that dictionaries started being written, pronunciation books started being written, grammar books started being written, and it's only towards the 18th and 19th century that one can see that the English, French, and Italian and other European languages developed to their modern format that we know today, with the rules of the language, the grammar, the pronunciation, and so on. So, for people like Joachim du Bellay, he provided a model for his students and other French writers. This is he's telling them, look, this is why you need to do, this is what you need to do to develop your own language. He gives the model of the Romans. He says the reason why les gestes in French means the glorious deeds, the great and glorious deeds. The reason why les gestes, the glorious deeds of the Roman people, were unanimously celebrated and preferred to the deeds of the rest of humanity, he explained in 1520, was because the Romans had a multitude of writers. The Romans had a multitude of writers. This is the reason why he says, in spite of the passage of time, the fierceness of battle, they had battles and wars everywhere, the vastness of Italy, their empire was huge, and foreign incursions, in spite of all of this, he says, the majority of their deeds, their exploits, their achievements have been in their entirety preserved until our time. Preserved meaning they have been recorded in books and poems, right? So Joachim du Bellay was essentially telling the French, look, if you want to become a big and mighty nation, you can follow the model of the Romans. Look at them. They combined military and political power with literature, and they produced great writers who recorded the achievements of the Romans in books and poems and literature. So you, the French, can do the same thing. If you want to become a great and mighty nation and have political and military power, you should produce writers, a lot of writers, that would make sure that your exploits, your achievements, your deeds can be recorded in poems and remain for eternity in that fashion, just like the Romans' achievement has been recorded and remains for eternity recorded for everybody to see and understand how great they were. So the important point here is that the emergence of what we call today literature, the emergence of literature in Renaissance Europe had a strong political motivation and purpose. People think literature is just about reading stories and enjoying reading stories. That's for as far as enjoyment, that's as far as literary appreciation, if you just want to appreciate a piece of literature. But if you want to study literature, if you want to be critical and analytical about literature, then you have to understand where it came from. And here in this instance, we realize that European literature emerged with a strong political and military push, because European countries, European states, were becoming big and powerful. They were building empires, and they felt the need to manage those empires, but they had weak languages. Their languages were not written languages, and they weren't fit for complex management and modern management of a modern empire. So they needed to develop their own language, and this is why they saw the Romans as a model. They saw that the Romans developed their own languages by imitating the Greeks, and they said, well, we, the Europeans today, can do the same thing and can imitate the Romans just like the Romans imitate the Greeks. We will develop our languages and make them sophisticated languages just like the Romans developed their language and created a sophisticated Latin language. We can produce sophisticated poems and books and plays just like the Romans produced sophisticated poems and books and plays by imitating the Greeks. The Europeans essentially were conquering land and taking over trade routes, and as the du Bellay, as we understand from the passage from Joachim du Bellay, poetry and literature were necessary for necessary accessories. They were necessary tools for political power. The logic is simply that great empires needed great literature, just like the Romans and the Greeks had. In that sense, basically, the study of classical learning, the study literature and criticism, all emerged with the purpose of giving the emerging European states written and civilized languages that are comparable to the languages of Greece and Rome. Essentially, it's very important to note that the Europeans saw poems and plays and books and stories like they were national monuments. So when you go to Rome and you see the Colosseum, you know, this big architectural structure very famous. Tourists from all over the world go to visit it. Poems and plays and books were the same thing. Everybody knows Homer and his poem, the Iliad, and everybody know that it's a great great Greek poem. So Homer's the Iliad and the Odyssey were like national monuments of the Greeks, just like Virgil's the Aeneid, the poem the Aeneid, was a national monument of the Romans. Europeans essentially in the early modern Europe and until the 17th, 18th century, they judged the greatness of a nation by the monuments it built, right? The Colosseum in Rome, for example, or other great monuments. And they saw books, poems, and plays and literature as monuments of greatness, of the greatness of these nations. A contemporary scholar, Anthony Pagden, in his book written in 1995, Lords of the World, Ideologies of Empire in Spain, Britain and France from 1500 to 1800, he explains this to us. He says, it was above all Rome which provided the ideologues of the colonial system of Spain, Britain and France with the language and political models they required for the Imperium Romanum, had always had a unique place in the political imagination of Western Europe. What he says, basically what he means, is that Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, had always had a spiritual connotation in European culture and European mind. And in building their European empires, France, England, Spain, they looked at Rome, because Rome had a special place for the Europeans. And the reason, Anthony Pagden says, is that not only was Rome believed to have been the largest and most powerful political community on earth, it was believed to be the most powerful empire on earth, but it has also been endowed by a succession of writers with a distinct, sometimes divinely inspired purpose. They had writers. They were powerful politically, but they also had writers. So this is the reason why literature developed in Europe using the tool of imitation. Europeans argued that we can build literature, we can build plays, poems that are great and glorious and can make us famous and can enrich our language and allow us to manage these empires. We can do all of this by following the model of the Romans, and the model of the Romans was to imitate the Greeks. So in the same way that the Romans imitated the Greeks, we, the Europeans, are going to imitate the Romans. So from the Renaissance all the way to the 20th century, European writers called for the imitation of the classics. Every book advises contemporary writers, look, if you want to be a great poet, imitate the Romans, imitate the classics. This is how the concept, the idea of imitation of the classics, or imitation of the ancients, or imitatio in Latin, this is the word in Latin, is imitatio, or the word mimesis, the Greek mimesis, or simply the word imitation in French, in English. This is how these words became, from the Renaissance to the 20th century, they became the most prestigious and classical concepts in European cultures. There is no other concepts that have had such a strong and formative and fundamental influence in modern European cultures like these concepts of imitation had. But of course, like we saw in Rome, imitation doesn't lead to originality. Imitation always leads to the production of a culture that's plagiaristic, imitative, and lacks a originality. So in Rome, imitation led to frustration and produced a plagiaristic culture. Europeans simply ignored these complications. The desire to produce poetic monuments, to produce plays like monuments, like architectural monuments, the desire to produce poetic and literary monuments to go with their political and military power was more important. If imitation is allowing us to produce plays and literature and, then that's good enough. I don't need to worry about whether this literature is imitative, whether we come second, whether we come third. And like the Romans, who, because they were powerful, they felt insulted that they have to come second after these little Greeks, this little province Greece. Europeans were different. They weren't powerful. Europe was coming out of the Middle Ages. It didn't have languages. Most its population were illiterate. So Europe was culturally inferior to the classical cultures of Greece and Rome. And the Europeans didn't feel any shame in imitating the Romans. And essentially, as long as imitation kept producing textual monuments, plays, poems, as long as imitation kept producing textual monuments in the forms of books, poems and plays, European writers were happy with it. For example, Joachim du Bellay addresses this very same point. He says, look, don't feel ashamed, he tells the writers of his day. He says, it is a sign of great elegance. It is actually elegant and nice to imitate, what others do, to imitate the Romans. We should do, he says, he compared this to the work that bees, he says, the work that the bees do. He said the bees, they fly over flowers, they take some from this flower, some from this flower, some from this flower, and then they produce honey, and the final product is beautiful and tasteful and delicious, but you can't tell where it's coming from anymore, because the material that was taken from the flowers was digested by the bee, and then the final product is something beautiful and perfect in the end. So he says, it is a sign of great elegance and skill for us in imitation of the bees to produce in our own words thoughts borrowed from others. He told his contemporary writers, the writers of his days, he said, don't be ashamed to write in your native language in imitation of the ancients. He says, it is no vicious thing but praiseworthy to borrow from a foreign tongue, from a foreign language, sentences and words to appropriate them to our own. He says, I wish we had our own language. I wish our own language was so rich in domestic models and that it would be unnecessary for us to imitate or to borrow from other people's languages, but that's not the case. We have to borrow from other people's languages. Essentially, this essentially explains to us the contradictions and complications surrounding the development of literature in European cultures. Europeans adopted the Roman desire to produce a literary culture in imitation of the Greeks, without realizing that this imitation method had failed in Greece. The Europeans didn't realize that this method of imitation had failed in Rome, so they just adopted it not knowing it had failed in Europe, and that this imitation method had produced an imitative and plagiaristic culture that remained inferior to the original Greek culture that it tried to mimic and duplicate. In addition, Europeans thought that they were imitating the classical cultures of Greece and Rome. The Europeans, they thought they were imitating the classics, Greek and Romans. In reality, Europeans were imitating mostly the Romans. Very few Greek texts were available in Europe before the 19th century. And those who read and studied and imitated the Greeks, they imitated them through the Roman perspective. When they praised Homer, they praised him because Virgil, the Roman poet, praised Homer. When they imitated Plato, when they praised Plato or Aristotle, it's because Roman writers praised Plato and Aristotle. But the Europeans themselves didn't have direct contact to the Greek text till very late in the 19th century. Even artistic movements like classicism, for example, European classicism for hundreds of years, was telling us that it's based its practice and its theory on Aristotle's ideas. New research is showing that European classicism knew very little Aristotle. Most of the people who promoted the theory of classicism in 17th and 18th century, even in 19th century, knew very little Aristotle, or even read very little Aristotle in their life. John Draper makes this point about Aristotle in his study about classicism in the 18th century. He says a first-hand knowledge of Aristotle, even in translation, meaning in a European language or in Latin, seems to have been an exception. Knowledge of Aristotle was not the rule. Hardly anybody had first-hand knowledge of Aristotle. Walpole, for example, mentions him 5 times in his letters, just mentions the name. Usually coupled with Bossuet and the rules, and Cowper, a poet, at the age of 53, he says had never in his life pursued a page of Aristotle. The Poetics, Aristotle's famous book about literature, the Poetics was much reverenced, it was respected by everyone, but very little read. This is John W. Draper, Aristotelian Mimesis in 18th century England. It's an article that was published back in 1921. Renaissance scholars, essentially European scholars, they could tell that Roman art and literature were derived from the Greeks. They could tell that the Romans imitated the Greeks, but they couldn't tell how plagiaristic the Romans were. And therefore, this is how we find some grotesque classifications in European literature, where they find Horace, for example, the Latin poet Horace, is classified as a better literary critic than Aristotle. Or we find that Seneca, the Roman playwright, is classified in European classifications, is presented as a more accomplished and better dramatist than Sophocles, the Greek playwright Sophocles or Euripides. What is important to note here is that literature is not simply, stories that we read in books. And literary criticism is not simply a discussion of the content of the book, of a novel or a play or stories. We need to realize that there is stories behind those stories. There is more fascinating and real and more important stories behind those stories that we read in the plays and in the novels and in the poems. This is important because it allows us to understand that literature emerged in Europe because of historical forces. There was historical forces, political, economic, cultural, military forces that produced, that made literature, that created literature as an institution, as a tradition, and as a discourse possible. The second point that's important to understand is that the new historical realities of the Renaissance and the 17th, 18th, all the way until the 20th century, that literature itself went to contribute to producing these new realities. So in that sense, historical forces produce literature, and literature goes to produce historical forces. In this sense, literature is connected to history from both ends, in terms of its origins and in terms of its contribution to reality. We have to understand the historical forces that produce literature, and we have to understand the historical forces and the transformations that literature goes to produce. It is in this way, when we understand this relationship of literature to history, this is how we can study literature from a critical and analytical perspective. And in this sense, in this class and in your future study about literature, this is the type of critical consciousness you need to have. You shouldn't just consume the stories of poems and books and novels. You should be critical and take literature, even literature as an institution like we're doing here, or the plays and the poems and the books, and place them within their historical context. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time, where we will talk about in details about the Greek literary theories that emerged with Plato and Aristotle. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
أخذت